welcome to the channel. If you love stories about entitled people and neighborhood drama, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button to join our community, and let's get started with today's insane story. Mark whistled a cheerful tune, the leash of his golden retriever, Buddy, looped comfortably around his wrist. Buddy, a picture of canine contentment, trotted alongside him, his tail wagging in a steady rhythm that mirrored the peacefulness of the late afternoon. Willow Creek Lane was the epitome of suburban tranquility. Manicured lawns, houses painted in harmonious shades of beige and gray, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was Tuesday, Mark's well-deserved day off, and this walk with Buddy was a cherished ritual, a moment of calm in an otherwise hectic week. As they approached the corner of Elm Street, Mark noticed Karen, his neighbor from 2 houses down, standing on her porch. Karen was a figure well known and not entirely well loved in Willow Creek. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a permanent air of disapproval clinging to her like a too-tight cardigan. Her thin lips were usually pressed into a tight line, and her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, seemed to constantly scan for infractions of her unwritten neighborhood code. Today she was sporting a particularly vibrant floral dress, a riot of pink and purple that seemed to clash with her sour expression. Mark, ever the polite neighbor, offered a friendly greeting. "Good afternoon, Karen," he said, his voice calm and even. He hoped to pass by without incident, but the look on Karen's face suggested that wasn't going to happen. Karen's response was immediate and sharp. "That dog," she spat, the word laced with disdain, her finger pointing accusingly at Buddy, who, oblivious to the animosity, simply wagged his tail harder. "Do you have a permit for that beast?" Mark stopped dead in his tracks, genuinely bewildered. He blinked, wondering if he'd misheard. "A permit?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "To walk my dog? On a public street?" Karen's posture stiffened, her back ramrod straight. "Of course. This is a respectable neighborhood, young man, not some dog park. There are rules, regulations. We have standards here on Willow Creek Lane." Mark, a reasonable and patient man, attempted to defuse the situation. "Karen, I've lived here for 5 years. I've walked Buddy every day, sometimes twice a day. There's never been any mention of a permit. I'm pretty sure there's no such thing." He tried to keep his tone light, but he could feel a knot of frustration tightening in his stomach. He knew Karen had a reputation for being difficult, but this was beyond anything he'd expected. Karen, however, was not to be reasoned with. Her face was rapidly turning a shade of crimson that made her floral dress seem even more garish. "Mistaken?" she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "How dare you imply that I'm mistaken? I've lived on this street for 20 years. I know the bylaws. I practically wrote the bylaws." Mark doubted that very much, but he knew arguing would be futile. "Karen, with all due respect," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I really don't think there's any law requiring a permit to walk a dog on a public sidewalk." This proved to be the breaking point. Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "Respect? You have no respect. You and that mutt are disrupting the peace. You're endangering the community. I'm calling the police." She fumbled for her phone, her fingers, adorned with several large, ostentatious rings, jabbing at the screen with surprising speed. Mark was momentarily speechless. He stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and exasperation washing over him. "You're calling the police, because I'm walking my dog?" he asked, incredulity lacing his voice. It felt like he'd stepped into some bizarre alternate reality. "You're violating neighborhood ordinances," Karen declared, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. You're loitering with a large, unleashed animal. It's a menace." Buddy, at this point, was sitting calmly at Mark's side, looking utterly bewildered. Mark considered simply walking away, leaving Karen to rant into her phone. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. She'd probably just complain to the Homeowners Association, or worse, continue to harass him. He decided to stand his ground, a sense of weary resignation settling over him. He watched as Karen spoke rapidly into her phone, her voice a high-pitched whine that carried across the quiet street. She painted a picture of Mark and Buddy as some sort of public menace, a clear and present danger to the tranquility of Willow Creek Lane. She emphasized his disrespectful attitude and his refusal to comply with her imaginary rules. Buddy, sensing the tension, whined softly and nudged Mark's hand with his wet nose. Mark stroked his head, finding a small measure of comfort in the dog's unwavering affection. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical. Almost. He was standing on a public street, being berated by a neighbor for walking his dog, and now the police were being called. He wondered what the officers would think when they arrived. He hoped they'd have a sense of humor. He tried to remain calm, but his heart was definitely beating faster. He took a deep breath, trying to control the rising tide of frustration. He just wanted to finish his walk, go home and relax. This was not how he'd envisioned spending his afternoon. He glanced at Buddy, who looked back at him with large, innocent eyes. The dog had no idea what was going on, of course. He was just happy to be outside with his human. Karen, having finished her call, glared at Mark with a triumphant smirk. "They're on their way," she announced, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You'll be sorry you ever crossed me, young man." Mark just sighed. This was going to be a long afternoon. The peaceful walk was definitely over. The quiet of Willow Creek Lane had been shattered by the shrill voice of an entitled neighbor and the looming arrival of the police. All because he was walking his dog. A few minutes after Karen's triumphant declaration, a police cruiser, lights flashing silently, pulled up to the curb in front of her house. Two officers, Officer David Miller, a young, fresh-faced officer, and Officer Sarah Chin, a more seasoned officer with a calm, observant demeanor, emerged from the vehicle. Mark watched them approach, a mixture of relief and apprehension swirling within him. He hoped they would quickly see the absurdity of the situation, but he also knew that dealing with Karen could be unpredictable. Karen, practically vibrating with self-importance, rushed towards the officers, her floral dress billowing around her. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man," she pointed dramatically at Mark, "is refusing to comply with neighborhood regulations. He's walking his dog without a permit. It's a menace. He's been harassing me." Officer Chin held up a hand, her expression neutral. "Ma'am, please calm down. We'll get to the bottom of this." "Sir," she turned to Mark, "can you tell us what happened?" Mark, relieved to finally have a chance to speak, calmly explained the situation. "I was simply walking my dog Buddy as I do every day. Karen here stopped me and demanded to see a permit to walk him. I tried to explain that no such permit exists, but she became increasingly agitated and called you." Buddy, sensing that he was the subject of conversation, wagged his tail and looked up at Officer Miller, who couldn't help but smile. Officer Miller gently scratched Buddy behind the ears, further cementing the dog's non-threatening demeanor. Karen, however, was not finished. "He's lying. He's been disrespectful. He's been loitering with that creature." She sputtered, her face red with indignation. Officer Chin turned back to Karen, her voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, we need you to stay calm and let us assess the situation." "Sir," she addressed Mark again, "do you have any identification?" Mark produced his driver's license, which Officer Chin examined. "And do you live in this neighborhood, Mr. Peterson?" "Yes, 2 houses down," Mark replied, gesturing in the direction of his house. "I've lived here for 5 years. Never had any problems before." Officer Miller, who had been quietly observing Buddy, spoke up. "He seems like a pretty well-behaved dog, sir." "He is," Mark agreed. "He's a certified good boy." He couldn't resist a small smile. Karen, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frantic. "Officers, aren't you going to arrest him? He's breaking the law. He needs to be taught a lesson." Officer Chin exchanged a look with Officer Miller, a subtle arch of an eyebrow conveying a shared sense of amusement and disbelief. Officer Chin then turned back to Karen, her voice carefully measured. "Ma'am, we've assessed the situation, and we've found no evidence that Mr. Peterson has broken any laws. There is no ordinance in this city or this county that requires a permit to walk a dog on a public street, provided the dog is on a leash and under control, which Mr. Peterson's dog clearly is." Karen's jaw dropped. But, the regulations, the bylaws, I know they exist." Officer Chen's patience seemed to be wearing thin, but her voice remained professional. "Ma'am, perhaps you're mistaken. We've checked with dispatch and there are no such regulations on the books. We suggest you consult the city's official website or contact the city clerk's office if you have further questions." Karen sputtered, trying to form a coherent sentence, but she was clearly flustered. Officer Miller, taking pity on her, or perhaps just wanting to end the encounter, added, "Ma'am, with all due respect, maybe you should reconsider your approach to neighborhood disputes. Calling the police for a non-emergency like this takes resources away from actual emergencies." Officer Chin nodded in agreement. "We have to respond to every call, ma'am, but it's important to use 911 for genuine emergencies only." Mark, feeling a surge of vindication, thanked the officers for their professionalism. "Thank you, officers. I appreciate your understanding." Buddy, as if sensing that the conflict was resolved, let out a happy bark and wagged his tail even harder. Karen, defeated but still fuming, retreated to her porch, muttering under her breath about incompetent police and disrespectful neighbors. Officer Chin and Officer Miller exchanged another look, a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity they had just witnessed. As they walked back to their cruiser, Officer Miller couldn't resist one last comment. "You know, sir," he said to Mark with a grin, "I think your dog is probably more qualified to be a neighborhood watch member than your neighbor." Mark chuckled. "I think you might be right, officer." He watched as the police car pulled away, the flashing lights now off. The street was quiet again, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves and Buddy's contented panting. He resumed his walk, feeling a sense of relief and a renewed appreciation for the simple pleasures of a walk with his dog. He knew he hadn't seen the last of Karen, but for now at least the battle was won. The absurdity, however, had only just begun. He had a feeling this story was far from over. He made a mental note to perhaps avoid walking past Karen's house for a while, just in case. It was better to be safe than sorry, especially when dealing with someone so unique. Mark had hoped that the police incident would be the end of it. He'd been proven right, Karen had been somewhat rebuked, and he could go back to enjoying his peaceful walks with Buddy. Unfortunately, Karen had other plans. The days following the confrontation were marked by a series of increasingly bizarre and annoying events. First, there were the anonymous complaints to the Homeowners Association, HOA. Mark received a series of vaguely worded letters from the HOA management company, citing violations of obscure rules he'd never heard of. One complaint mentioned excessive dog barking, despite Buddy being notoriously quiet. Another cited improper leash length, claiming Buddy's leash was too long and potentially hazardous. Mark measured the leash. It was well within the standard 6-foot limit. Then came the passive-aggressive notes left on his doorstep. These notes, written in a shaky, overly ornate script, contained cryptic warnings about unruly animals and the deterioration of neighborhood standards. Mark suspected Karen, but he couldn't prove it. The notes were unsigned, and the handwriting, while distinctive, wasn't definitively identifiable. The social atmosphere on Willow Creek Lane also shifted. Some neighbors, clearly influenced by Karen's whispers, started giving Mark and Buddy a wide berth. He'd catch snippets of conversations, hushed whispers about that dog and the trouble he's causing. It was like being in a high school drama, but with middle-aged adults. Mark tried to ignore it to focus on the positive. He still had friends in the neighborhood, people who knew Karen's reputation and saw through her antics. But the constant scrutiny and the feeling of being ostracized started to wear him down. He considered confronting Karen directly, but he knew that would likely escalate the situation. He decided to focus on navigating the HOA bureaucracy. He meticulously documented every incident, every complaint, every note. He researched the HOA bylaws, becoming intimately familiar with the arcane rules governing pet ownership, noise levels, and even the acceptable color of garden gnomes. Apparently, chartreuse was strictly prohibited. The culmination of Karen's campaign arrived in the form of a formal notice from the HOA. It was a summons to a hearing scheduled for the following week, to address multiple complaints regarding animal control violations, specifically concerning a golden retriever named Buddy. The notice listed a litany of alleged infractions, most of which were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Mark felt a surge of anger and frustration. This was ridiculous. He was being forced to defend himself and his dog against baseless accusations fueled by one person's vendetta. He knew he had to prepare thoroughly. He gathered evidence, including photos of Buddy, vet records confirming his good health and temperament, and even testimonials from neighbors who were willing to speak on his behalf. He also started to suspect that Karen was actively trying to turn other neighbors against him. He'd seen her talking to several residents on the street, her gestures animated and her expression intense. He could only imagine what she was telling them. It was a campaign of misinformation, designed to paint him and Buddy as a menace to the community. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with anxiety. Mark found it difficult to sleep, his mind racing with possible scenarios and arguments. He knew he was in the right, but he also knew that Karen was a formidable opponent, skilled in the art of manipulation and bureaucratic warfare. He was facing not just Karen, but a system that, while ostensibly designed to maintain order, could be easily weaponized by a determined and vindictive individual. The hearing loomed large, a battleground where the fate of his peaceful walks with Buddy, and perhaps his continued residence on Willow Creek Lane, would be decided. He felt like he was fighting a war on two fronts. He had a battle in his hands. He did not want to move out, so he would do anything to keep living in his house. The day of the HOA hearing arrived, and Mark felt a knot of tension in his stomach. He'd spent countless hours preparing, organizing his evidence, and rehearsing his arguments. He arrived at the community center where the hearing was being held, with Buddy, on a perfectly legal 6-foot leash, at his side. Buddy, sensing Mark's anxiety, nudged his hand reassuringly. The meeting room was surprisingly full. Several neighbors were present, some clearly on Karen's side, others seemingly neutral, and a few who Mark knew to be his allies. Karen sat at a table opposite Mark, a smug expression on her face, surrounded by a stack of papers that looked more intimidating than they probably were. The HOA president, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Henderson, called the meeting to order. This hearing is convened to address complaints regarding Mr. Mark Peterson's dog, Buddy, and alleged violations of HOA regulations, she announced, her voice echoing in the room. Karen was the first to present her case. She launched into a lengthy tirade, accusing Mark of everything from allowing Buddy to terrorize the neighborhood to intentionally disrupting her prize-winning petunia garden. She presented her evidence, which consisted mostly of blurry photos of Buddy walking on the sidewalk and handwritten notes about excessive barking that lacked any specific dates or times. Mark, when it was his turn, calmly and methodically presented his defense. He showed photos of Buddy interacting peacefully with other dogs and children, vet records proving his excellent health and temperament, and letters of support from several neighbors. He refuted each of Karen's accusations with factual evidence, pointing out the inconsistencies and exaggerations in her claims. He also addressed the permit issue head-on, presenting copies of the city ordinances that clearly stated no such permit was required. He emphasized that he'd been a responsible pet owner for 5 years, always cleaning up after Buddy and ensuring he was on a leash. Then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Thompson, a quiet, elderly woman who lived across the street from Karen, stood up. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice trembling slightly. All eyes turned to her. Mrs. Thompson, who had initially seemed sympathetic to Karen, revealed that Karen had approached her several times, pressuring her to sign a petition against Mark and Buddy. "She told me lies about Mr. Peterson and his dog," Mrs. Thompson said. "She said the dog was vicious, that it had attacked people. But I've seen that dog and he's a gentle giant. I've never seen him be anything but friendly." Another neighbor, Mr. Johnson, also spoke up. "I have to agree," he said. "Karen came to my house too, trying to get me to complain about the dog. She said he was always barking, but I've never heard him bark excessively. I think Karen just has it in for Mr. Peterson." One by one, other neighbors who had initially been swayed by Karen's rhetoric began to voice their doubts. It became clear that Karen had been systematically manipulating people, spreading misinformation and exploiting their fears to further her personal vendetta. Karen, her face turning increasingly red, tried to interrupt, to shout down the dissenting voices, but Mrs. Henderson firmly silenced her. "Ms. Miller," she said, her voice sharp, "you've had your turn. Let others speak." The tide had turned completely. What had started as a hearing against Mark and Buddy had become an exposé of Karen's manipulative tactics and her long history of causing trouble in the neighborhood. Finally, Mrs. Henderson called for a vote. The HOA board members, after a brief deliberation, announced their decision. "We find in favor of Mr. Peterson," Mrs. Henderson declared. "There is no evidence to support the claims of violations. Mr. Peterson is a responsible pet owner, and Buddy is a well-behaved dog." A collective sigh of relief went through the room, and Mark felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He reached down and scratched Buddy behind the ears, the dog thumping his tail against the floor. But the story didn't end there. Mrs. Henderson continued, Furthermore, we have received numerous complaints about Ms. Miller's behavior, her repeated false accusations, and her harassment of neighbors. The board has decided to issue a formal warning to Ms. Miller. Further violations will result in fines and, potentially, legal action. Karen, for the first time, looked genuinely shocked. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She sat there, deflated and defeated, her reign of terror seemingly over. Mark and Buddy left the community center to a chorus of congratulations and apologies from neighbors who had previously doubted him. The sun seemed to shine brighter, the air felt cleaner, and the walk home was the most enjoyable he'd had in weeks. The following days saw a dramatic shift in the atmosphere on Willow Creek Lane. Karen retreated into her house, rarely seen outside. The anonymous notes stopped and the whispers ceased. Mark and Buddy were welcomed back into the fold, their walks once again peaceful and uneventful. The story of Mark, Buddy, and the dog Permit became a legendary tale in the neighborhood, a cautionary example of what happens when entitlement and vindictiveness go unchecked. And Mark, forever grateful for the unexpected support of his neighbors, learned that even the most absurd situations can have a surprisingly satisfying ending. He also made sure to always carry a copy of the city ordinances with him, just in case. He even bought Buddy a new toy to celebrate his victory. Life on Willow Creek Lane was good again. Subscribe, or Karen might move in next door to you. Just kidding, mostly. Don't take the chance, hit that subscribe button.